Nunakot, Wanju, Wanju, Nija, Nunga, Wuja. This seminar today is being hosted on the unceded lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people of Western Australia. I pay my respects to elders and leaders, past, present, and emerging. I acknowledge too that there are numerous participants across country in Australia and from more than 20 different countries with us today. Thank you for joining us across borders, boundaries, time zones, and disciplines. You are all very welcome. Kaya. My name is Tanya Fitzgerald, and I'm Dean and Head of the Graduate School of Education at the University of Western Australia, and it is my pleasure to act as moderator today. This inaugural seminar, Doing Critical Education Policy Research, A Picture and 1,000 Words, is a collaboration between the Education Policy, Leadership and Practice Research Group at the University of Western Australia and the Critical Education Policy Research Community in the Institute of Education at the University of Manchester. And we hope the first in a series of collaborative events. Our presenters today have diverse histories of and engagement with critical research. Using one visual image and 1,000 words, each will reflect on the following questions. What does criticality mean? What does it mean to be a critical scholar in differing context? And what does it mean to do critical work? There are 4 presenters, and you will see us all on the screen with you today. Each will speak for approximately 10 minutes. If you have any questions for our presenters, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and there will be time at the conclusion of the talks for us to address those questions. Our first speaker today is Helen Gunter, Professor of Education Policy at the University of Manchester. Her talk is entitled, What We Do on the Pavement, Critical Research. Helen.
Thanks very much, Tanya, for that generous introduction. It's great to be in collaboration with the University of Western Australia. And thank you so much to Glenn for all his expertise in getting this first seminar live with us today. Can I welcome all of our visitors to the webinar today from all over the world. Very much looking forward to engaging with you this morning and beyond the seminar. My picture is of a street with a pavement and lampposts that's typical of a village, a town or a cityscape in England, but also globally. This is a metaphor for thinking about intellectual work in critical education policy studies. I'm going to begin with the metaphor of the pavement and the street by reading you an extract from Alan Bennett's diaries in 1997. 13th of May, Colin Haycraft and I are chatting on the pavement when a man comes past, wheeling a basket of shopping. Out of the way, you so-called intellectuals, he snarls, blocking the bleep way. It's curious, it's the intellectual that annoys, though it must never be admitted to be the genuine article, but always pseudo or so-called. It is, of course, only in England that intellectual is an insult anyway. What I want to do today is focus on what we do as critical researchers on the metaphorical education policy pavement. We do vital work, but it's often positioned as getting in the way of the real work and the real workers. In fact, critical research is mainstream, but we're positioned as marginal. As a field, we need to confront this and confront this because our work is being turned into forms of ordinary and professional critique. Taking ordinary critique first, an ordinary critical approach is actually endemic in our everyday lives. Our person is carrying the shopping, is making a critique of 2 people stood on the pavement chatting, And of course, so is Alan Bennett critiquing being interrupted by a shopper. And therefore, we may sit in our armchairs and comment on TV programmes or a tweet. We may eat in a restaurant and be asked to provide feedback. We're bombarded with emails asking us to tell us what our experience has been. We may be wowed, we may become fans, we may nitpick or trash, and such responses can be reactive based on beliefs and articulated opinions. And in fact, in England, in other parts of the world, we can actually watch people watching TV so we can critique the critics, and that's called Gogglebox. Now, critical education policy researchers are being misrepresented as ordinary critics who promote opinions rather than present facts and analysis. The second type is a career as a professional critic. And it means someone can speak and write about their expertise in things like sport, food, films, books, theatre, and so on, and use a combination of knowledge and experience. Such professional critics are seen as vital, but often have a bad press because they're based on matters of taste rather than objectivity, and it can actually make or break a career. As Gardner once said of the playwright John Osborne once said, "Asking a working writer what he feels about critics is like asking a lamppost what it feels about dogs." The lamppost is meant to do a public service and light the way during hours of darkness, but it's actually being used for urination. In Osborne's world, the writer as a lamppost has no choice. And so ordinary and professional critics are what writers have to put up with. Critical education policy researchers are being misrepresented as professional critics who have turned the promotion of opinions into high art form, using esoteric language, presenting bias as analysis, and producing articles and books that no one reads. Are we really ordinary and professional critics who not only get in the way of the pavement, but actually urinate on the world? In other words, we do something that's natural and necessary for us, but is disagreeable for the recipient and those who are watching. Certainly, there's plenty of evidence that researchers are being positioned in this way. For example, education professionals in England are encouraged to ignore us on the pavement, to shout at us and even accuse us of micturating on them. This anti-intellectual, anti-social science culture camp reaches the highest offices, where Michael Gove, the former Secretary of State for Education, responded to a letter by 100 professors about his proposed curriculum reforms by writing an article in the Mail on Sunday, labelling us as the blob, enemies of promise, and of course the usual Marxist label. Firing back at this is an ongoing requirement for us as critical researchers. We have not only to challenge this position, but also to continue to do critical research. This is what's both exciting and exhausting. Our job as critical researchers is to describe, develop understandings and explanations. Yes, we do that at a distance of the actuality of practice. We do need to have space to think. But we also, as full-time professional researchers and as part-time researching professionals, also need to follow Michael Apple's advice to actually come down off the balcony. Once we're off the balcony, then we're on the pavement, with and alongside the profession, children and communities. This not only means that we can know and understand better, and also challenge the field to think and do differently. So for example, at Manchester, a group of us have been working on the segregation of the provision of and access to school places, where we've identified the endurance of eugenicist ideology. Gove and others who want to protect their entitlements position us as unpleasant and irrelevant, and their preferred researchers attack us openly in sessions or privately through peer review. Why is that? Because of course we would raise unpleasant questions, but necessary questions. For example, school effectiveness and school improvement movement seek to improve and make effective a segregated system where millions of dollars and pounds are invested in keeping children out of a school. So there is a need to move from the functionality of the organisation to the realities of what it means to work there and how this reveals structural injustices that require activism. As Parker and Thomas have argued, that thinking and doing otherwise means that critical researchers, quote, self-consciously claim dissent as their distinctiveness. How do we handle distinctiveness and the plurality in the SEPS field that requires such dissent? What are our lampposts? What are our pavements? In fact, I think in order to address such a question, we need a stronger sense of our historiography. Notably, there were a series of journal articles plus this edited collection from, it doesn't show on the screen, there it is. Never mind, I'll read it out. It's called Researching Education Policy, Ethical and Methodological Issues, and it's from 1994 by Halpin and Troiner. This is a really seriously important book. In the final chapter, Halpin raises the issue that the field is dominated by sociology at the expense of contributions from other disciplines in the social sciences. In 2020, I did a higher degree in which I charted my own work within policy scholarship, and I identified the overdominance of policy sociology as a form of what Dale describes as disciplinary parochialism. So how do we take this forward? In 2024, it's the 30th anniversary of this book. And I really do think that we ought to return to the book, but in order to do that, we need to address what Stuart Ransom calls the fissiparous tendencies within the field, certainly on the pavement and the lampposts, where there are clashes and silences, confrontations, and walking and talking past each other. It seems that critical education policy researchers may become trapped as irrelevant and ordinary and professional critics. And so working for critical education policy requires not only education, excellent research, but also productive debates on our own pavements about our own lampposts. And that, of course, is knowledge production regarding the sources, processes, and enactments of education policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen. That's a stimulating start to our seminar this afternoon, and I see the questions are already coming in. Our next presenter is Jacob Broom, a PhD candidate in the School of Social Sciences at the University of Western Australia. And Jacob's talk is titled Becoming and Remaining Critical. Jacob.
Thank you, Tanya. And thank you to Glenn for inviting me to give this talk and into this forum. I am not an education scholar, but I do think of myself as a critical policy researcher. And I took this picture myself in so-called Forest Chase on Whadjuk Noongar country during the global climate strikes of September 2019, as I tried to work out how many people were around. So you should be able to see my brother's head just beside me here. And in this talk, I'm going to tell you some stories about my introduction to an experience of criticality in academia, and I'm going to link them back to this photo. In 2013, when I was 18, I took Politics 101 in my first semester of an undergraduate law degree. And as a middle-class white boy for whom nothing had really gone wrong, I was pretty easily persuaded by the tenets of classical liberalism, as I'm sure you can imagine. So for the first 6 weeks or so, university education positioned me to be pretty conservative. The thing that made me question this worldview was not delivered in a classroom, but was posted on the social media site Tumblr by a complete stranger. For those who don't know, Tumblr is basically Twitter without the character limit and without the celebrities. I came up on a post by a user called Maggot Master, which said something along the lines of, liberals think the US government is great, but actually it is bad. I clicked through to their blog and found post after post of what I would later learn were Marxist-Leninist critiques of capitalism. This was the purpose of their blog and the blogs of their friends, to discuss ideas as young people interacting across great distance on the internet. And this sparked an ongoing journey for me through the fractured subculture that is online leftism, which has exposed me to the worldviews of an array of leftist and critical political stances. My new Marxist politics drove me to give up the idea of doing law by the end of that first semester. I think I told my mum that it was too bourgeois, which she found very funny. Instead, I enrolled in units like gender studies, histories of white supremacy, international political economy, and social movement studies, which filled out the rest of my undergraduate degree. These units and their wonderful lecturers and tutors introduced me to the ideas and thinkers of critical scholarship. And probably somewhat archaically, I still think of the names that were mentioned then whenever I hear critical research today: Karl Marx, Max Horkheimer, and Robert Cox. For them, I was told, critical scholarship means to conduct research and create theory that advances the liberation of the masses from oppression, nothing more and nothing less. Whether that be along the lines of race, gender, or class. And hearing this during my second year in undergrad got me onto the streets at every major protest in Perth. I realized that protests were critical essays written in action, statements that the powerful have got it wrong and that the world needs reorganizing. However, these units also took me in a very different trajectory, which was they made me sure that becoming a critical academic was what I wanted to do with my life. Now that I am in it, though, as a PhD student, I found that the realities of practicing critical research and being a critical academic are often uncomfortable and conflicted in ways that I didn't expect and which protest is not. I think that some part of me naively believed that we could simply critique the world into a better shape, that people in power would just listen if I told them why their ideas reproduce domination rather than dismantling it. And in some ways, that naivety applies to protest too. But my experiences with interviewing for my PhD project showed that the difficulties of criticality have an affective dimension. My participants are barely elites, but they organize the lives of marginalized people as part of their everyday work. And in speaking with them, I found that they've begun to organize me too. So I could not profess my disagreement when they brought up and brushed away anti-capitalist and social democratic critiques, or my discomfort when they tested me on my knowledge of technical finance that I have no interest in, for fear that I would jeopardize my temporary place within their world and lose out on information that might be important to the thing I could produce later. So studying power closely and empirically subjected me to it in uncomfortable ways that were nothing like the emboldening feeling of solidarity at a protest. Another issue is that having critical academic be a career path carries its own set of tensions. For all of us, but especially for PhD students and for early career researchers, the structure of the university and the casualization of its workforce involves enormous exploitation, which I know plays on my mind and the minds of other PhD students whose destinies are supposed to lie in academia. A recent audit of casual work done by the University of Sydney Casuals Network found that 84% of its participants performed unpaid work. And the gatekeeping and the rent seeking involved in journal publishing, I don't even have time to go into. Yet to advance our careers and to create better critical research, we must work in universities and we must publish in journals. So perversely, the task set by Horkheimer and co to use critique to liberate has become an avenue that funnels people into a highly exploitative industry. So rather than ending on that note, where do these difficulties leave us? In my view, the tensions running through critical academia mean that if we are committed to critical politics, to challenging power, and to redefining the problems of the world in the terms of the marginalized and oppressed, going to work every day is not enough. We must show up to support those organizing such challenges on the streets. And that's why I chose this photo, to reinforce that our criticality cannot exist purely in articles most people have no access to or interest in. What we can also do, and what we're uniquely positioned to do as critical researchers, is fulfill the role that Maggot Master played in my life for others. If not for the critical ideas of that corner of Tumblr, and for my undergraduate lecturers and tutors, I would not be speaking here today, and I likely would not have been at the global climate strike in 2019. Spreading the core ideas of criticality to people who would not have heard them otherwise, through mass public forums, through weird corners of the online, and through our teaching, has great potential to get more people into the academy, more critical people into the academy, to fight against exploitation and onto the streets. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jacob. That's a fantastic segue in from Helen and thinking about pavements and you thinking about what people do on pavements and the importance of being there, to be Hughes, who's a senior tutor in educational leadership and policy at the University of Manchester, who's now going to talk to us with the title, Talking Heads, Navigating the Tensions Between an Educational Professional and Professional Researcher. Welcome, B.
Thank you, Tanya, and thank you, Helen and Jacob, for your illuminations of your perspectives on criticality. And it's a great pleasure for me to be here, and good day and good evening to everybody who's joined us. I suppose I'm on the pavement taking a photograph and I suppose behind me, art is a form of protest. And I feel quite uncomfortable, but as a critical researcher, I think that comes probably with the job. So perhaps I should explain myself. Well, rather, I should first explain the photo that sits behind me. It was taken in the centre of Manchester, where I live, as part of the City Council's commitment to protest, perhaps, or even to urban art. It depicts a series of images of heads that have commonality, but are different in shape, outlook, and identity. For me, the picture symbolises the various positions I've held as an educational professional over a 30-year career in high schools, both in the UK and in Hong Kong. The image of different heads has also come to symbolise my new position as a professional researcher and academic. These two standpoints met head-on during fieldwork I undertook as part of my doctoral study, which investigated the emergence of a chief executive officer of a multi-academy trust, or MAT, as a new role within the provision of public education in England. As a former head teacher, I was curious to understand this position. CEOs oversee schools, usually organised within a charitable trust arrangement. MATs operate independently of the local government authority. They are overseen by a board of governors, contractually tied to the Secretary of State for Education. I spent a year engaged in ethnographic encounters with a CEO, a man called K.T. Edwards. As an educational professional, I had a strong professional identity, so gaining access to Edwards was aided by my understanding of gatekeepers, governance arrangements, and how schools work. This professional status eased my entry into Edwards' work in the world of the MAT. Informed by the ebb and flow of a school year and the demands of the job, I carefully timed my initial contact with the respective gatekeepers. Such inside knowledge as a professional educator was instrumental in gaining access and acceptance. I soon developed a rapport with Edwards. We had a shared language and understanding of schools, of leadership. I was a fellow professional. I knew how schools worked. But my uncomfort or my discomfort became more apparent. Wearing my researcher hat, however, I was clear on my own positionality. In my head, I was professional stranger, bound by professional knowledge, but acting as a stranger to the practices of the CEO, whose work, it became clear, is different and distinct from a head teacher or principal. Thus, my participation was minimal. I displayed tact and courtesy in the field. I often hid behind my visitor name badge. I maintained my outsiderness. Inevitably, there was a constant interplay between my educational professional and my researcher identity. This interplay related to my head teacher instinct, in wondering how the staff felt, wishing to chat to teachers in staff rooms, accompanied by my natural desire to talk to students in corridors and even pick up litter, dare I suggest. Such activities, however, were not part of my researcher role. As a critical researcher, I sought insights into the embodiment of policy and leadership practices where agendas were set, where nothing is taken as a given, and where judgment is a capacity to think critically. I was observing, shadowing, dialogically engaging with Edwards, where constantly repositioning myself helped to normalise my presence. For example, as his shadow on the move, I walked slightly behind him at his shoulder, where I could observe the invisible aspects of his work. I offered little unless invited to speak, yet through a series of interviews with Edwards, I was able to probe and question. Oftentimes after the recorder was switched off, further conversations, head to head, so to speak, revealed a further illumination of his world. My relationship with Edwards developed where closeness made understanding possible in the Arendtian sense, where such thinking and judging helps to loosen the grip of the universal and render the particular. Thus, in thinking critically about Edwards' work in particular, I began to think around the interplay between power, agency, and structure. Edwards embodies the current dark times, both structural and cultural, of public education, where he has repudiated the past elements of public education and embraced a corporate identity as a new modernizer. This has resulted in the notion of publicness being depoliticized in order to legitimize private interests, arenas, and advantages. His oversight of the MAT, with its signature pedagogies, opaque accountability, supported networks developed and maintained as systems and circuits bearing power, raised critical questions about the position of this new educational professional in public education in England. My private musings as an educational professional were translated into expressing judgments as a researcher, where Hannah Arendt, the political theorist, suggests, quote, judgment may liberate itself from the subjective private conditions. This liberation ensued through the presence of others. I was able to resist, concerned with the particulars and things close at hand, where for Arendt, critical thinking became possible when the standpoints of all others are open to inspection. I recognise Edwards as a CEO represented the reconceptualising of the head teacher through the restructuring of public service education. This position found in a particular education provider operates in diverse spaces that lie within and beyond the mat, perhaps on the pavement even, on the street. The position is complex and is connected to the political, ideological and structural dimensions of education. It speaks to the marginalisation of the professional, and where normalised models of leadership, such as transformational leader, have been replaced by notions of system leadership, incorporating the CEO position. These new actors, I discovered, are incubated and conditioned in managerialist theories of leadership founded on corporate principles, readily adopted by successive governments and delivered through private contractors and non-executive agencies who have supported the creation of the corporate executive as an agent of neoliberalism. So as a critical researcher, my particular resistance to the restructuring of public education in the form of MATs and CEOs is to critically document these new dark times for public education, and in so doing to explain the collapse of the public education system signifies a critical rupture, a headache, but for critical scholars, caused by deprofessionalisation and depoliticalisation. Thank you.
Thank you, Bea. I think the notion of the critical ruptures is certainly coming through on all of our talks today. Our final presenter is Glenn Savage, a policy sociologist and associate professor in the University of Western Australia. And his talk is called Rage and Desire. Glenn, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tanya, and thanks so much everyone for joining us today in the various time zones that you're in. I've chosen this image today, which you may be able to get a sense of if I move around, because to me this image speaks really powerfully to my own history and my motivations to engage in critical academic research. So this is a picture of the punk band Black Flag, which is one of many bands associated with the American hardcore punk scene that had a deeply formative influence on me when I was a teenager. The rage, the desire to challenge, receive wisdom, to fight back against inequalities that contour our lives. These were core features of the hardcore scene, and as a teenager were central to what I understood as adopting a critical disposition. The work I do now, many decades on, is best described as policy sociology. And to me, the way I approach research as a critical policy sociologist retains multiple traces of my historical rage and desire. Much like my teenage self, whenever someone claims something is inevitable or authentic or that's the way things should be, my immediate reaction is always to ask, who says? Why? Does it have to be that way? Over the past year, I've been involved in editing a special issue for the journal Critical Studies in Education, and it's on the evolving state of policy sociology. One thing that's been really clear from the articles in the edition is that notions of being critical or engaging in critique have been central to that field of study for many years. As Jenny Oscar argues in her article in the special issue, she always saw a commitment to criticality as implicit to policy sociology. But what does that commitment actually mean in practice? And this is a question I think that's easier posed than answered. To me, there's multiple facets and more than I can begin to capture today. But let me just draw attention to what I see as a few. First of all, to me, I see criticality as primarily about an agitative relationship to power. I see agitation, however, as quite different from my earlier youthful interests in revolutionising or overthrowing. Instead, agitation to me now means a more pragmatic understanding of my positioning and my potential to influence change. It does not mean taking a simplistic view or creating binaries of good or bad, left or right, as if critical research is like the resistance fighters taking on the imperial empire. You might think I'm being facetious, but I feel like I see too much of this goody and baddie talk amongst researchers who dare to call themselves critical. Public is good, private is bad, neoliberalism is bad, the welfare state is good, as if the poles created on either side of the spectrum are so knowable and so clear. Related to this, I also understand criticality as driven by a desire for transformation. But in line with this agitative stance, I think the potential for change lies not in drawing lines in the sand and firing shots over to the other side, but instead working in the vast grey space in between. So for me, agitation and transformation require a strategic probing into things, a seeking out of loose threads that, if pulled, could lead to a rearrangement of the current state of affairs. And I see this work as difficult and deeply political. So, for example, in recent years, I've been working on several commission projects with government, and I've been working closely with the very policy elites who are often simplistically portrayed as part of the problem. But I don't see it that way. I see many talented, smart, and critical policy actors who are often receptive to productive dialogue and critique. But I think that relationship needs to be carefully cultivated and treated with respect. So I see my role in these elite policy spaces not as a kind of crusader coming at power from the outside, but as someone imminently embedded within those structures of power, openly seeking to work with and to engage policy actors in discussions about their work and how it might be done differently. Now, sometimes this agitation leads nowhere. Often it leads nowhere, but sometimes I have seen it produce productive change. And this to me leads to another question, which I think is crucial, which is what might the role of a critical researcher be if one seeks to unleash their focus from the ivory tower and engage in forms of public intellectualism? Now, this is a question I've been giving a bit of thought to lately, and it pops up briefly in a new paper that I've published with Jessica Gerard, Trevor Gale, and Tebejay Molla as part of the aforementioned special issue. One of the arguments we make in that paper is that many researchers who articulate their work as critical are also deeply skeptical of work that might be seen as solutions-driven or as explicitly seeking to contribute to education reform. So some prefer to engage in problematization and critique, but explicitly avoid forms of solution construction. Now, we critique this position, arguing that processes of solution construction are just as capable as acts of problematization are to produce new possibilities for thinking and understanding the world. And from my perspective, I see real and worrying limits with the common mantra of critique for the sake of critique, Not that that's not important in some circumstances, but I think we need to argue beyond that for a critical approach to reform thinking. And I actually think we have a public role and a responsibility to use critical knowledge to forge new ways forward. Now, of course, another element to all of this is that to be critical, I think one needs to critique themselves. So I think we always need to turn the lens 180 degrees and engage in ongoing reflection about the things we say, the things we claim, and the things we do. In fact, I'm not sure we could plausibly claim to be a critical researcher if we don't hold ourselves up to as much critique as we seek to subject others to. Finally, one thing I definitely don't think criticality should be is a brand label or an academic fashion identity to cover one's work when there's when there's nothing substantive behind it. And I'm sure we've all seen some deeply unreflective and uncritical work come from scholars who tell the reader they're critical. And this is exactly what led me to feel disenfranchised from my early PhD years interest in critical pedagogy scholarship. Now, there's some good scholarship in that field, but I found that so many people writing in the critical pedagogy tradition were all telling me they were critical, but they were often all singing from the same hymn book and rehearsing worn-out scripts. So as bands like Black Flag argued 4 decades ago, if we want to take things forward and take them forward in new directions, you've got to change the scripts, not repeat them. And that's what I'm going to try and keep doing moving forward in my own work. And, you know, I may not be screaming into the microphone doing it like I was as a 15-year-old, but I hope that my rage and my desire to keep agitating will continue through my academic work. Thank you very much. And I look forward to discussion and questions.
Thank you very much, Glenn and colleagues. I'm just having a look through the various questions. Just bringing together some of the thoughts today. Words like, as I was writing down as various speakers were talking to us, agitation, power, protest, positionality, tensions, resistance, transformative potential. One of the questions that's come in, can critical scholarship articulate the technical blueprint for a unified, alternative and viable economic and political structure? Or has it been subsumed into neoliberalism? Helen, what would be your response to that? Can critical scholarship articulate the technical blueprint for a unified, alternate and viable economic and political structure? And I turn to you knowing your background in politics as well.
Thank you very much indeed for the question. I think it's an important one regarding how we place ourselves. I think the answer to my direct answer to that question is no. I don't think that is our job, to actually give the solution or a blueprint. I think what's integral to critical scholarship is drawing on and enabling the intellectual resources for us to think about those kinds of possibilities and also work together as citizens, if you like. Sorry, the question is moving down the list as others are coming in. And to think about the possibilities and also work as co-citizens in the public realm regarding these matters. I think what we can do is we can, as other speakers have said this morning, generate ideas, analyse those ideas, engage in conversations in the public realm regarding those ideas and evidence, but also come out of the library, or in Michael Apple's terms, come off the balcony and work in the public realm in an activist way. And one of the issues in the critical field is the nature of the contribution. So if you look, for example, at the work of the late Barry Troyner, he argues that one of the serious problems in policy scholarship is that people will critique or pick over the bones of the problem, but not necessarily do anything about it. So, and actually be activists. So I think it's the activism with the ideas to work through a solution or possibilities, and to keep working at them, because we'll never achieve any kind of nirvana, but to keep working in that way. I think that's what it's about. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you to the audience too for the feedback about the format of the seminar today, as well as your comments on each of the speakers. As I had mentioned at the start, this is an inaugural seminar, so we're deeply appreciative of your comments. Jacob, if I could turn to you, I have a question that I'd like to put to you, and it comes from, really stimulated from Glenn's evocative address this afternoon. The question, Jacob, is what script might you wanting to be, what script might you want to change through your PhD studies?
Well, my PhD studies interrogates the world of a particular mobile policy model that is involved in the financialization of social services. Social impact bonds is what I'm looking at. I don't know if I feel that I am positioned to change such a script. I guess I could. Like I said in my talk, I think that the sort of places that I get put in relation to the people who are designing these scripts and who are implementing policy scripts, I guess is the way I'm using the term script, is not one in which I have a say in changing. And I guess maybe the end product, when I've published 1,000 articles on this and excoriated all of these people or whatever, maybe the end product does something to shift how this script is imagined by the people I'm talking to. But I mean, to be realistic and honest, I think that the changing of social scripts more broadly and more political and economic scripts comes from the people in the picture behind me, and not the people in not my kind of PhD work. And I think that's driven by the contradictions and tensions that I identified in university, critical academic as a career path, basically.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Bea, I'm going to turn to you now. And my question is, what would be your critique of your work?
Incomplete and ongoing. It's very interesting because listening to Glenn talk about the non-binary and listening to Helen and Jacob imploring us to be activists and also to be on the pavement and shifting our positions into physical positions often into the workplace, into the spaces where people that we are looking at and practices we're looking at operate. So in terms of my critique of my work, I think we need to be in that place. We need to be on the pavement. We need to be in the street far more and engaging with. So it's not a binary, as Glenn suggested. It's more about being observing and as Michael Apple says, being a critical secretary to plot and to, present what is actually happening on the street or in places of power. So I think the work is ongoing, as Helen said. We'll never achieve a nirvana, but we'll die trying to, I think. So that's where I would say the work needs to happen. And private musings that I started with now become recognising almost totalitarian regimes of leadership, which is important. And obviously, finally, paying witness to the fact that public education is being subsumed into the private. That troubles me greatly.
That's a brilliant segue into my next question, which I'm going to put to Glenn. And the question from our audience is, how might critical scholars do their critical work and bring about change politically and socially in authoritarian contexts?
Yeah, so thanks, Aaron, for that question. And I can imagine, Aaron, why, reasons why you might be asking that question. I mean, I guess we have to think about how we understand or define authoritarian. I think over the years there's, we've had writers like Henry Giroux argue that America is an authoritarian system, in different ways. I mean, I guess, to me, it's about how do you speak in situations where your ability to speak is significantly hampered. I've grown up in liberal advanced democracies and worked in advanced liberal democracies where I've never been gagged, so to speak. But what I would say is that you feel gagged in different ways. I've often gone to say things and had to check myself and had to consider strategically whether putting something on paper is a good idea or not. And I can only imagine that in contexts where there are real consequences to your personal safety or your professional life to say things, those things would take on, an entirely heightened meaning. So I don't want to speak out of my realm of experience and speak about authoritarian contexts that I'm not, really across. But I guess what I would say is it sort of works in a point made by Stephen Rayner there in his comment as well about working with policy elites. I've always tried to be open to dialogue and discussion with people in the bowels of power, so to speak. But I've found that that's very difficult sometimes, and that across my career, I've felt very uncomfortable at certain moments in time. And, very long story short, when I started out, when I was in Jacob's position, I just felt like I was completely irrelevant. No one would ever want to listen to what I had to say about anything. And I felt like I had some good ideas that would never get listened to. Then I started doing some, work when I was at the University of Melbourne, doing some commission work where I was face to face with policy people. And I felt very scared to be more honest about how I felt about things. I felt that I was being silenced or talked down to, by people in power, like I was just this young kid that was dismissed. And then I went through a period of almost falling into line, for a few years and trying to be very careful about what I said and did. And it's only more recently as I've become a bit more experienced and developed a bit more of a track record and actually thought very carefully about how to strategically try and insert myself into policy conversations publicly at certain times, that I've felt more comfortable to sit back into my critical chair again and start to say, no, I've got something to say here, but you've just got to be careful about how you go about it. So sorry, Tanya, I sort of went across two questions there, but just trying to draw some links.
Yeah. Colleagues, if you're wanting to follow some of the comments on Twitter, the Graduate School of Education has a Twitter handle, GSE_UWA, and also our critical education policy colleagues at the University of Manchester, which is CEP_UOM. But please, if you've also joined us because of Glenn's original Twitter Twitter message, that put out the Eventbrite invitation for today, you'll find the conversation. And I thank you all for the comments that you have been making on Twitter as well in the Q&A. And the importance too of critical pedagogy and critical research. And thank you too, Lynn, for your comment. Please keep your rage and your intellectualism. Very important indeed. Helen, a question for you from the Q&A this afternoon. Are policy elites receptive to dialogue? What's your response to that?
Thank you, and thank you to Stephen for the question. Yes, I've been involved, obviously, with policy elites in a range of ways, from philanthropists to ministers, civil servants, and I was speaking to a front bench politician a few weeks ago. So in that sense, I do think that there is receptive to dialogue. I think that people are interested in the kinds of questions and issues that we're concerned to generate. And I've got a lot of experience of that. A lot of it isn't visible. And that's why I think we might think it doesn't happen. And a lot of it has to stay off the radar, because in seeking a range of views, people are very much concerned that in the modern world, who they're speaking with could actually be used against them. So I'm just going to put that up. What I do think, and I want to talk about here in its broadest sense, is what it means to be a policy actor, to work within a public system of government, to be a minister, a civil servant, an advisor, to have to make policy happen nationally, but also locally. My goodness, it's a difficult job. And I think that we've got a number of things for us to think about as critical researchers. First of all, recognise that the person in the job will have a mandate to govern. In other words, that's what elections do. And therefore, they've got responsibilities beyond you as the researcher. And I think recognising that, which is why I raise the issue in our field, that political sociology is what matters, not just the sociology. And we can't see politics as a subfield of sociology. It's actually vitally important that we understand public institutions and the way that constitutions and systems work. We might not always agree with them, but it's a system that's there, and therefore how do you access and enable within that? I also think that we have to recognise that not everyone in government is as knowledgeable about research as we are in terms of methodology and methods. In other words, when I've interviewed people and worked within the system, it's quite clear that particular personal private beliefs matter. After all, these people have stood for election and they've got a particular ideology, and that may be different to us. So how we navigate that, I think, is important. And also people's professional work. I know I've done interviews with people who've worked in education before they become an MP and before they become a minister. And they connect back to that time, no matter how outdated it is. They have a view as to how schools and universities work. So I think we need to understand that. But I also think we need to challenge things. We need to expect that people in government are prepared to listen to evidence and understand that evidence and work hard at understanding that evidence. If you recall, over 10 years ago, when we had the banking crisis and the crash, the Queen quite innocently, I don't think so, asked the question, didn't you all know that this was going to happen? She asked this of some economists at the Bank of England. In other words, what are you all doing as economists if you didn't know that banks were in crisis? And of course, it actually prompted a discussion about what value economic knowledge has in that context. And I think a lot of people fired back on it, but also lots of people said, it's one thing for us to know in universities, but there's an obligation of people in government to actually want to know and actually develop the skills and knowledge to know. And I think that the COVID-19 has raised that as well, because we've had scientific knowledge, but we know that the political decisions haven't always connected with that knowledge. And that's why in England, we've got 125,000 people sadly dead, quite frankly. So there are responsibilities on political actors, I think, policy actors, to engage with the field that we are part of and stop seeing us as critics who critique and see us as critical researchers.
Thank you very much, Helen. There are a number of questions that have come in that are directed or asked any one of our presenters directly. We don't have time to answer each of those questions, but could I encourage the audience to have a look at the University of Western Australia website. There you will find Glenn Savage's email and his research profile, and the same with Jacob Broom. If you want to contact them directly, they're very willing to be contacted if you have any questions or comments. B or Belinda Hughes at the University of Manchester, and of course Helen Gunter at the University of Manchester. I'm just going to wrap up with a few matters at the moment, and thank you all again for your participation and for the insightful questions. I think what's come across for me this afternoon is the importance of speaking out and speaking back, and the challenges that this presents for critical researchers really at various stages across their career, early career researchers, mid-career researchers, and those who are more experienced, but relying on a multiplicity and a diversity of voices to speak back to some of those agendas. And more importantly, not just to say these things, but ourselves be critical of our own work and critique our own work and its contribution to knowledge and knowledge production and the field itself. Possibly tomorrow, a recording of this seminar will be sent to all attendees. Glenn will be getting a link for that, and we'll probably also put that on Twitter. So if you're wanting to take a leisurely time to re-listen to some of the evocative talks this afternoon, please do. That link will be made available to you. In concluding, I would like to thank all of the presenters for their wisdom, their own criticality and positionality this afternoon, and rising to the challenge of 1,000 words in an image, and an image which would not only resonate with what they were talking about, what they were speaking back to, but also provide us with provocative moments ourselves within this seminar. I also like to thank you all as the audience. It's 5 o'clock here in Perth, Western Australia. It would be 9 o'clock in the UK, and wherever you are, there's probably various time zones that you're in. And I thank you all for joining us in the conversation this afternoon. There've been a number of references made to works that people have either produced or in production. Please do look for those literature references, or indeed get hold of each of our participants. And again, I thank you all for your participation today. Please keep an eye on Twitter for more seminars from this collaboration between the University of Western Australia and the University of Manchester. I say goodbye to you all.